Hey everybody, let's talk linguistics, and let's talk about Portuguese. That's right, I'm back with my second video in my three-part series about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. If you missed my first video where I talk about the origins of Portuguese as a language and a little bit about what linguistic evolution is, you might want to go watch that. The history of modern Portuguese can be roughly divided into three phases. We have classical Portuguese, which is measured from the 1500s until about the 1800s, modern Portuguese, which starts in roughly the 1800s, and contemporary Portuguese, which starts from the middle of the 20th century until today. There are many noted and progressive changes to the way Portuguese is spoken from classical Portuguese to now. But we have to start from classical Portuguese. The Portuguese of Europe directly and majorly influenced the Portuguese of Brazil until the latter part of the 1600s. So in this crucial period of classical Portuguese, we can see some of the developments of modern Portuguese and why some things are so similar and why other smaller details seem to have peculiarly developed separately in each place. Now, classical Portuguese is considered to begin in 1516 with the publication of the first text in modern Portuguese. That was the Cancioneiro Geral by Garcia de Rezende. But before we take note of some of the developments of modern Portuguese, it is important to talk a little bit about how Portuguese got to that point in 1516. Traditionally and historically, the center of prestige in Portuguese was located in the north of Portugal. The reason for this is that Portuguese stems from the Galician Portuguese language that was spoken in what is now the north of Portugal and the Galicia region in Spain. I talked a little bit about this in part 1 of this series. However, with the establishment of the University of Coimbra in 1290, which was done at first in Lisbon but bounced between Lisbon and Coimbra before officially settling in Coimbra in 1537, the center of prestige of Portuguese shifted southward. Ever since then, the standard of Portuguese has been measured against how people speak what is considered good Portuguese in the corridor that stretches from Lisbon to Coimbra. Purists of the language have also historically argued that Coimbra itself is the sole center of the Portuguese standard, as it is the home to the University of Coimbra. However, Lisbon, being the capital and the largest and most important city in Portugal, inevitably assumes the role of having the most influence on the Portuguese language as it is spoken in Europe. So the University of Coimbra, which is educating the very aristocrats that are deemed to have good Portuguese, is fixed in its place in 1537 in Coimbra. It is important to note that the first grammars of European languages begin to pop up in this period as well. Spanish was the first European language that codified its grammar in 1492. That was done famously upon recommendation to the Spanish monarchy that language could be used as a tool of empire. Logically, colonial pretenders followed suit, and not very long thereafter, these countries were publishing their own codified grammars. So the first Portuguese grammar is published in 1536. This codification of grammar is one of the formal signs of modern Portuguese. But we also know that up to the point of the codification of Portuguese grammar, the evolution of Portuguese grammar from its vulgar Latin beginnings is largely set into place. There are syntactic and other grammatical evolutions in Portuguese since the 1500s. However, by and large, Portuguese grammar, similar to that of Spanish as it was codified in 1492, is largely set into place. It is for this reason, among others, spelling notwithstanding, that a Portuguese person today can read texts from that era with minimal difficulties. Therefore, the greatest innovations in European Portuguese from this period come from a lexical and a phonological perspective. So although by the time we get to classic Portuguese, the grammar has largely been fixed in Portuguese, there are some notable grammatical developments. Chiefly among them in Portugal is the fixation of the pronoun system. Whereas in classical Portuguese, the placement of pronouns is largely flexible and variable, with a slight tendency toward procles, in European Portuguese by the 1800s, the preference for encles is consolidated. And that leads us to contemporary Portuguese. Whereas the placement of pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese continues to be variable and is frankly in a state of flux, in Europe, the consolidated fixed system of pronoun placement that emerged in the late 1800s has led us to a contemporary era in Portuguese in which encles is strongly favored. This is leading to subtle changes and a slight evolution in colloquial Portuguese. The very strong tendency tendency in European Portuguese toward enclise has led to the observation since the 1980s of a tendency of taking it just one step further. Since around the 1980s, there have been more and more documented cases of casual and colloquial use of constructions like deverias, in which the pronoun is placed at the very end as though it were enclise, even though formal grammar would prescribe mesoclise. You have probably seen somebody write this casually on your social media some way, somewhere, somehow, whether that's an example like deverias or direito. These small, informal, and colloquial adjustments are how linguistic evolution works. The other most notable grammatical evolution of European Portuguese, and Portuguese in general, is the dropping of the pronoun vós. By the 18th century, vós had by and large lost its colloquial usage. It was already then seen as an archaic and regional way of talking. But vós would persist in colloquial speech until about the 1800s, when it has been documented that it disappeared from use except in the northern regions of Portugal. The way we address each other in Portuguese is very complicated, and both Brazil and Portugal have their own individual paths in how they're evolving treatment of other people, but I am going to make another video talking in greater detail about how we address other people, including a little bit more about vós. But with the grammar out of the way, we can get into the more dramatic changes that have happened to European Portuguese since the classical period. Now, European Portuguese today is most well known for its highly reduced vowel system. I'm talking about the sounds that I detailed at length in my Portuguese versus Russian video, but those sounds didn't come just out of nowhere. The most notable examples of this are with the vowels O and E. The pronunciation of O at the end of words as an U sound dates back to the 17th century. There is no formal attestation of the U pronunciation before then, however, it is supposed that the A vowel was pronounced in a more closed manner, which led to an easy reduction of A to U. The way we get from E at the end of a word to however, is just slightly more complicated. In the 17th century, because of a tendency to a more closed vowel pronunciation, unstressed e at the end of words was reduced to an e sound. This is also why we see these in the Portuguese of Brazil as well, because the Portuguese of Brazil was still very largely influenced by Metropolitan Portuguese. So by the first decades of the 1700s, we have well-documented pronunciations of u and E at the end of words in Portuguese. European Portuguese would then take that another step further, starting in Lisbon. The sound is attested to Lisbon in the second half of the 1700s and would fully spread and consolidate in the rest of Portugal by the mid-1800s. So in Portugal, the word de would have gone from de to d to d. This happens as a natural result of the tendency in Lisbon to close off and push back vowel sounds in the mouth. This is also the case with unstressed vowels in other positions. You might have noticed that in Brazil they continue to say morar with an O sound, but in Portugal we say murar with an U sound. This is because that same tendency to reduce vowel sounds spread to other unstressed vowels in European Portuguese, with a difference of about 100 years. So from the 18th century, we begin to see the consolidation of all unstressed vowels in European Portuguese, starting in Lisbon. At the same time, in southern and central Portugal, we see the reduction of the diphthong O to an O sound. You may have noticed in Portugal that there are a lot of instances of oi replacing o, such as in words like toiru, oiru, and loisa, instead of toru, oru, and losa. This is because of that reduction of the diphthong. While the o diphthong was shifting into an o sound, many speakers began to replace it with oi in order to maintain the phonetic distinction. Curiously enough, Lisbon was not a part of this evolution, and so as a result, those forms in Portuguese are considered regionalisms. However, if you go to Continente, most anywhere in Portugal, you will be buying loisa and not losa. You can even see this on their website. This oi form is a distinctly European Portuguese innovation, and we have other regional developments in pronunciation as well in Portugal. Portuguese, by and large, maintains a distinction between B and V. Famously, Conversely, Spanish does not have this distinction. In Spanish, it's all one sound. And Spanish's influence over the Galician language led to Galician losing the distinction between B and V as well. So in Portugal, in the region between the Douro and the Minho, starting in the 16th century, the distinction between B and V was also lost. This is largely thanks to contact with and influence from Galician. This is why even nowadays, if you talk to somebody who's from the north, often they will say the word cove the same as they would say Kobe. To round out this evolution of sounds, however, we have to go back to Lisbon. As we have seen, Lisbon has been the center of a lot of phonological innovation in Portuguese. That continues to be the case to this day. When we think about one of the most distinctive features of Portuguese, we often think about the R. We think about how we hear that R sound in Europe. Well, that R sound came about in Lisbon in the 1800s. Although this pronunciation of R is often claimed to have started with the upper class imitating French pronunciation, it is much more likely that it started as the common class taking the rolled R and transforming it by pushing it yet again further back into the mouth until you have a rolling uvular R sound, which then can later be reduced to a R. The letter R in Portuguese, however, in both Brazil and Portugal is its own complicated topic that I'm planning on making a video about, so I will talk more about that in the future. But suffice it to say that the distinctive R sound that we know from European Portuguese started in Lisbon in the 1800s and gradually spread all the way through the rest of the country, consolidating itself in the latter half of the 20th century. It wasn't until mid-century in the 1900s that the R pronunciation fell out of its distinction as the preferred prestige pronunciation. And last but not least, in the order of shifting vowels, we have one more thing from Lisbon to talk about. I'm talking about the pronunciation of E before certain consonants in nasal sounds and in the diphthong A. You may have noticed that people from Lisbon in all of those instances pronounce the E sound as an A sound. This leads to joelho being pronounced joalho, or words like velho as in old and valho from the verb valer sounding the same. Valho. This also leads to the classic pronunciation of I in the diphthong A, but it also leads to the nasal vowel ang turning into ang, which rhymes with mang. Therefore, we have bang and mine as rhyming words. Although these are typical pronunciations from Lisbon, they have not yet spread to the entirety of Portugal and are thus not seen as the standard, but they are recognized as acceptable forms of pronunciation. And if you study Portuguese in Lisbon, at a minimum, you will be taught that também and mãe have rhyming vowel sounds. But I think that is more than enough for this video. I hope you've gotten a little bit of a better picture of how European Portuguese has evolved and what the tendencies behind that are. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel. I make videos about food, culture, and the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.